Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking with Jonathan Kubesh, who is a PhD student at Virginia Tech. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thanks for talking with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's start out by telling everyone just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I'm a new PhD student here at Virginia Tech. I just moved up last week. I got my undergraduate degree at Ohio State and then a master's degree at the University of Tennessee. One of the best ways to describe what I do is I work in grassland systems and forages. So forages are the things that our livestock eat or that are part of our landscape for different roles, such as maintaining water quality, carbon sequestration, and nutrient cycling. Where this kind of ties into the main focus of today's podcast is that I do a lot of work with the native clovers of the eastern United States. It's an exciting group with a lot of species in it, and they have a lot of benefits in our ecosystems and just in general.
And that's interesting. I've always thought of forages as just being the things eat and never really thought of them as being used for that carbon sequestration and those sorts of things either. So
a lot of agriculture has been rightly brought into explanation about how can we produce more food sustainably and what are the other services that we're expecting out of areas. The interesting thing about a lot of science involving grasslands and cow pastures is that we're trying to look at those benefits early, because one of the best ways to protect soil is to have permanent vegetation. One of the best ways to maintain high quality water in watersheds is to just make sure that you have a lot of roots that are going into the soil and taking in both a lot of water, a lot of runoff nutrients, and just kind of holding things in place. And so at least since the late 60s, we've been doing a lot of work in grasslands trying to improve some of these other ecosystem services that we provide to the landscape.
So you have been doing a lot of work recently with clovers, looking at the native clovers, some of the endangered clovers, and then also looking at some of the propagation methods, and then bringing in your agricultural background, your agronomy background, to look at it from that aspect, which I really love, because I think it's important to have these different bridges between the fields. For so long, we looked at this field and that field and really put them in their own silos. And we still fall into that trap a lot of times, even just in our own backyard, saying, this is a butterfly garden or this is a pollinator garden, and forgetting that it's actually can be part of a bigger, larger ecosystem, and looking at, okay, yeah, if you plant the pollinator garden, you have the caterpillars in there, birds are going to come in, they're going to eat the caterpillars. Does that mean the songbirds are bad? No, it's part of that whole functioning ecosystem. So I love this bridging between the different fields and looking at that broader aspect and bringing in those different perspectives.
Why, thank you.
Let's kind of step back a little bit here, because I know we've been talking about clovers, but clovers tend to be multiple different things, or we use the term to mean multiple different things sometimes, from just like the big broad clover category that we often lump in, not only like the white clovers, red clovers that we find in our yards, but also the sweet clovers, which are sometimes planted for forage. They're exotic. Looking at the prairie clovers, which are some of our native clovers. But then there's also the more specific group, the true clovers. And correct me if I'm wrong, but those are just the genus Trifolium, correct?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you broke down the term clover. When you think about the white clovers and the red clovers you see in your yard and around your house, those are what we're looking for. We're looking for three little leaflets, and they're generally forming either a trident or kind of tripod of growth, and it comes off of either a central crown, so like it's a dense group of growth like what you see the red clovers make, or you see a runner on the ground or a stolon, and those are the white clovers. So they either run or they're centralized, and they have three leaflets. And they, in general, stay close to the ground. The maximum growth is maybe a 3-foot spread, and we're talking maybe 6 inches of height.
So all the trifoliums have the normal clover leaf that we've known from the time we were kindergarten or so.
Yeah, and everything is just based off that simple plan. Some species have even thinner leaves, but it's still those three leaflets. Others have big fat leaves or big fat runners, and they all make those common flower heads with a whole bunch of little florets on the inside.
So basically, when we're talking trifoliums, from just a purely practical, hands on the ground type aspect, our true clovers are all the shorter ones, and they're all just generic clovers. I know that's very non-ecologically and scientifically correct, but would that be kind of the general way for somebody that didn't want to get into all the different little botanical names and nomenclature and taxonomy to just very quickly go, yeah, that's a true clover. No, that's probably not one.
I think that that's a pretty fair assessment. And I mean, in general, if this often comes up with a lot of people where I'm a little uncomfortable about digging into the taxonomy or going through a field guide. I mean, even I use mental search images. So what I'm describing to you or what you're thinking of when you traditionally think of clover, that's going to be at 98% of the time. And if you find a 4-leaf clover from one of these native species, congrats. And I'm sure that you're not going to say, well, this ain't a clover no more. But yeah, for the most part, leaves of 3, either coming out of a dense crown or a central point, or they're spread along a runner is a good way to look for them.
So how many species of true clovers do we have?
Here in the eastern U.S., we have a total of, I think it's 8 or 9 at this point. However, as you go towards the West Coast, the diversity of the trifolium genus is huge, and there's a lot of species that have been identified out there and developed after you go past the Great Plains. So once you get into the Rockies and you go further west, you see a lot of really neat stuff.
Okay. And of those 8 or 9 species, are those all the native ones, or do they also include some of these exotics?
I'm only talking about the natives here. If we were to go to the full list, I think Michael Vincent did a survey of just Kentucky, and I think it was 11 or so trifolium species total, and that included the stuff that was introduced from Europe and Asia, as well as the stuff from just Kentucky itself. But yeah, there's a lot more introduced diversity to the states than there is native species.
Okay.
So it's a very exciting pool, and a lot of these are associated with some of the historical disturbance regimes. Some of them are associated with the edaphic or the soil conditions, and some of them are associated with things that in traditional ecology we hadn't really thought much of until just about the millennium, when we started thinking about grazing animals being part of ecology and where do grazing animals fit in all of these different tool sets that nature uses to develop plant communities.
Okay. And you were talking about how you get more diversity as you go west.
Mm-hmm.
Within the eastern U.S., is there a north-south gradient too, or is it just kind of the species may change, but pretty much the diversity is pretty evenly distributed?
I would say that that's a fantastic question because there is a little bit of a gradient. However, a lot of it really depends on where you are in relation to the glaciers. So glaciers come in from Canada in the north, and they bulldoze everything flat to. I actually grew up in Hamilton, Ohio, right on the end of the glacial till, and then everything to the south remained unglaciated. So a lot of these clovers are occurring off of the glacial till. So the diversity is tied a lot to the historic development of some of these areas. So when we think a lot about some of these example species, the bluegrass region of Kentucky is this special ecological hotspot. There's limestone underneath it. There used to be a lot of big animals, and that has a totally different story than, say, the Pennyroyal Plains in western Kentucky, which were flat. They were settling out from a previous glaciation, and there's different kind of animals and fire history over in that direction. I mean, the gradient kind of drops out. I'd say North Florida, middle of Florida would be a good place with a coastal plain. Mm-hmm. A lot of the species are tied to Appalachia and to a little bit of the surrounding geography would be a good way to describe it. So kind of, if we were going from north to south, if we're walking through this, nothing, clover, and then clover. So it kind of drops off as we go a little bit south. But previous research, you can grow these plants anywhere. I've actually grown them north of glacial till. There's a lot of experiments about that to question, did the clovers come before the glaciers or did they come after? And there's some really cool stories about that.
Yeah, I bet. And I love your description of that too, because that I can picture when you go clover, nothing, 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 clover, clover. Yeah, that helps a lot with kind of picturing how this plays out. So when we're talking about these native clovers and mentioning them, are there any that we would probably recognize or see, or are the clovers that most everyone's familiar with going to be the exotic ones?
Unfortunately, unless you're in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, a little bit of Virginia, and so on, a lot of the clovers that you would see on roadsides and in your yard are going to be introduced species. The big two are red clover, which is Trifolium pratense, or some people call it pratense. The other one is going to be white clover, which is Trifolium repens. And those are kind of the benchmark agricultural clovers. Both of these came over with the Europeans in the 1700s, and they were included both when people were trying to improve the pasture land, as well as a lot of times there's cases to be made for a lot of these being weeds that came along with Europeans as they were settling into areas. One of the neat things about white clover is that it probably beat most of the settlers into the Ohio River Valley and into Kentucky. And it came in with the long hunters who would come across the mountains, hunt for a few seasons, and then come back over. So it was just hitching a ride into these communities. A lot of the stuff in your yard is not going to be even magical varieties of red or white clover. It's just the stuff that's naturalized into the local flora. The good thing about red and white clover compared to a lot of times when we think about introduced species is that they've naturalized fairly well, and they haven't really changed a lot of the nutrient dynamics in a lot of our ecosystems. So while you may be going out to a local park and you see, oh, white clover, we need to rip that out, and we need to clean, we need to spray, we need to take care of it. It's not nearly as much of an ecological concern as, say, Japanese honeysuckle, garlic mustard, and a lot of these other plants, which really change the nutrient cycling in these systems, and they really compete against the native plants a lot more aggressively than white clover.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely a difference between invasive species and just naturalized exotic ones that they've found a way to fit in, and that's about it. And then with the white clovers, there's a lot of cultivars for them too, correct? So the white clovers would include the Ladino clover, the Dutch white clover, all of those, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of that is due to the fact that Trifolium as a genus, clovers as a genus, have this concept of phenotypic plasticity. So I could plant the same clone multiple times in different environments, and each environment would give you a different growth form or a different growth habit for a lot of these. Now, when we talk about Ladino versus a white clover, a lot of times that's based on improved genetic improvement and a lot of breeding that was done in the 1930s through the 1960s by a lot of our agricultural experiment stations. But some of this is also just due to, I found a really rich pocket of fertility, so I'm going to grow as big as I can get, grow as long as I can get to establish new plants along my stolon. The cool thing about all Trifolium species, and I know that this is going to become immediately dated right after this comes out because somebody's going to find the species that breaks the rule, but most all of the Trifolium species have so long of a shelf life. So when we think about trees, we think trees just live forever until they get knocked down, or they have this lifespan that's so far beyond our life scale. They're basically immortal. Then we think about something like, say, corn, or a few of our little annual wildflowers where they come up, they make a seed, they throw the seed to the wind, and they die. And that's the life cycle. A lot of clovers are between annual and perennial, but the longest lived perennials are generally live only 3 years.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of our recommendations in agronomy are based around trying to see how long we can maintain these plants to that 3-year maximum. So a crown is just the point where the plant is growing out of. This is the starting point. If I am a taproot or a cone like red clover, I'm stuck here. I can't move anywhere. I have to make seeds. That way I can continue my genetics and this long, ever-marching baton handoff of survival in the species. With white clover, one of the ways I can persist is I throw a stolon out from my crown and I go and root into a new place. And that new crown is me. I continue along that way. But I only have 3 years at this one particular spot. And after that, dead.
Okay, but each little place that you rerouted has another 3 years.
Exactly. And that's really important for a lot of these stoloniferous or running clovers.
Very cool. So with our native clovers, since they're not ones that most of us have seen or are very familiar with, is it because they're living in these very specific locations that are kind of remote and pristine and just nobody really goes there? Or is it because they're endangered or threatened? Or why don't we know about them?
Well, I think one of the big reasons that we don't know about these clovers in general is because when I'm telling you about clover, I'm for the most part talking to you about something that came in a bag with a European settler back in the day. When you go to botanists or the people who really highlight individual plants, why would I look at a clover? We've got clovers in my yard. This stuff came over on the boat, and a lot of the introduced species take the limelight away from these natives. Now, when we talk about going out and seeing them in the wild, a lot of times, a lot of these native clovers are either threatened or endangered. And so a lot of people in the conservation community are very mindful about who knows where to find these plants. And it takes a lot of trust building to make sure people don't go and collect them in the wild. Or a bigger thing is if people mistake them for the introduced stuff and they try and kill them out or don't really care about how they manage them. A big reason why these clovers aren't even widely dispersed is there are a few of them that are attached to disturbance regimes that we've kind of eliminated, and there are a few that are tied to very special soil conditions. So I know you had Dwayne Estes on earlier, and he was talking a little bit about some of the grazing and fire regimes that used to exist, especially in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, and southern Ohio, as well as some of the fire regimes that used to occur further to the west. There's just something about settlement where people don't like a lot of fires burning up open woodlands. Settlers don't really like wild animals. They bring in cattle. And a lot of our early models about how we manage grazing animals was we set them and forget them. Everybody has that neighbor who has a big field and they have one or two cows, and those cows just have full run of the place and they're just going around, and their foraging behavior doesn't mimic these concentrated grazing events that would happen with big herds moving back and forward across the landscape. In Kentucky, if you've ever been to Frankfort, or if you drink bourbon, there's a distillery known as Buffalo Trace, and that's tied back to buffalo moving along these traces to go to mineral licks and to move along landscapes. A lot of our clovers are tied to those. However, I also said some of them are tied to special soil conditions. So we talk about the glades in the Nashville area, the Nashville Basin. We have these glade communities where the soil conditions and the shallow topsoil covered with changing hydrology make this weird ecosystem that can't really support a lot of tall growing things. Great spot for a clover. And in fact, these glades have their own glade clover. And when we get across the mountains over to where I am in, say, Virginia, and then moving north into Maryland, even parts of Pennsylvania, we have this Virginia clover, this Cade Mountain clover, which is associated with shale barrens. And these areas that don't really have a lot of vegetation, it's really hard to, as a plant, get established, put down roots, take up nutrients easily. But clovers just seem to fit the bill in that kind of space. They're very good at getting the resources and really just kind of persisting in these kind of unsavory places in the landscape.
Very interesting. And we'll come back to that buffalo stuff in a few minutes because I've got a few questions with that, kind of based off of some of the other research and work that you've been doing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you were mentioning Dwayne Estes and some of the work that he was talking about with the grasslands.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he said was that some of the places that we find some of these remnant grasslands are along like right-of-way corridors or along the sides of the roads where you are getting that disturbance and that management regime coming up. Are those places that we might find some of these native clovers, or have they been looked for in those places, or is that just not the right places?
Well, that's actually a fantastic question because one of those power line corridors was pretty close to where one of the rarest native clovers, Kentucky clover, kind of comes out of. It was in the woodlands away from the actual right-of-way, so how much the right-of-way influenced the clovers of question, but a lot of these will occur in areas where some kind of human interaction is keeping things going, less so from vegetation management, but more because of us having these clodhoppers that we call feet. There's the running buffalo clover, which the name comes from the assumption that buffalo moving in herds would run along these areas either by scraping the seed coat or by cutting the runners off of these plants, promoting their growth. And so they're tied to being disturbed and ripped up, which is very unusual. A lot of our endangered species are very sensitive to getting stepped on, but this thing loves it. And one of the places where it persists extremely well is along some of these hiking and biking trails in southwestern Ohio, where people are regularly just running over it, not even aware that they're touching an endangered species with their bicycle wheel, or they're hiking along the trail and they just happen to step on it. And I mean, one of my favorite places to see this species is a place called Shawnee Lookout. And there used to be a campground there in the 1940s. So you can imagine, as you're trying to put these new plants into the ground and you dig up old glass bottles and this and that, the other, but this history of being stepped on and ripped up and just messed with is very beneficial for a lot of these species. Well, at least in the case of running buffalo or just being interacted with. Glade communities are a little bit different, as are shale barrens, because a lot of those times it's associated with just the way that the soil and the hydrology works. And a lot of trails don't necessarily pick up on them. Clovers have this unique feature compared to a lot of our native vegetation in that they have a lot of protein and very low fiber in their nutritive value. So their chemical composition and their ability for animals to take them up and enjoy them. So it's very hard to see a lot of plant material at a time because there's a lot of herbivory going on too. So the animals are kind of hiding them. They're generally in these out-of-the-way places, or they're tied to regimes that we don't really see a lot of because a lot of our natural areas are not disturbed in the way that you would see if we were to, say, have wild bison roaming around.
Okay. And you said that the one was found in the woods next to the right-of-way.
Yeah.
Does that mean that these tend to be shadier or partly shady versus more sunny-loving plants?
It's actually a great debate, and I've seen some great evidence. One of my former advisors did some research about how well do they grow in the sun versus the shade using a greenhouse experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And the proof is that these plants can do kind of well in these open woodlands, almost verging onto what Dwayne calls a savanna.
Okay.
And they've done well in places like cemeteries with mowing keeps the competition kind of low for these plants. And they'll do well in the sun, but it seems to be they haven't made in the shade just because there's not a lot of other competitive exotic plants that are competing with them in these shaded areas. There's a lot of room for work on this, though. And I mean, the main study species that we use is running buffalo clover.
Okay. But there are other native species as well that may have other needs. Well, you've mentioned the shale communities and the glade communities, which would obviously be a little bit different, I would assume.
Oh, absolutely.
You've talked about the buffalo and the bison being so important for the grazing regimes and the disturbance factors for these native clovers. What about cattle? Can cattle play a similar role if you have that more intensively grazed rotational grazing regime? Not the let's stick them out there and wherever they go, but kind of trying to mimic more of that bison or buffalo movement?
Well, that's actually a perfect question. The main species of these native clovers, Trifolium stolonifera, is the running buffalo clover, and it's the one most associated with bison disturbance. There's Trifolium reflexum, which some people call buffalo clover. I call it annual buffalo clover, and it's anywhere from an annual to a biennial across its range. That's more associated with white-tailed deer and some of our smaller grazing animals.
Oh.
Now, the cool thing about buffalo in the eastern United States is that we're dealing with an animal about the size of a cow and with some similar grazing habits. Now, we have to be careful when we try to say, what about cattle? Because, again, if we're doing a lot of traditional forage management, a lot of our recommendations on my side, working with traditional grassland sciences, okay, we're going to graze down to 3 inches, then we're going to move to the next spot. Or we're looking to be able to put this many pounds of animal on this many acres, and we're assuming that the resident material is going to just bounce right back if we have this many animals concentrated. Unfortunately, for a lot of our native ecosystems, we just can't handle that much animal poundage on the acre, and we really need to rethink how we manage. There's definitely a case for trying to integrate cattle, and there's been a lot of experimental work that's getting started on that. One of the best places is Eastern Kentucky University has some running buffalo clover populations, and they've toyed with having cattle there, not nearly as heavy as we would traditionally use in a grazing system. This would be great for somebody who has a hobby farm and is able to manage with that. And I'm sure there's plenty of room in the next 5 or 6 years as we're bringing some of these bigger grazing experiments online with what's going to be sustainable economically for somebody who owns land, has cattle, as well as trying to meet the needs of the plant. Very often, one of the best things that would be useful is to just set aside when we're going to have our grazing event on these areas. So for management of running buffalo clover on a lot of these sites where people have mowers is they clip the vegetation right after the seed is set. And so the seeds are ready to go. They just need to get maybe scratched by a mower blade. They just need to touch the ground. We're going to take away the competition for a little bit and let them come back. And there's some work there that could be done about bringing cattle in. With the annual buffalo clover that reflects them, one of the big things too is to try and bring back fire. And in those kind of ecosystems, this pyrrhic herbivory thing that was kind of developed out in the Great Plains at Oklahoma State might play a role. I think cattle have a place, and if we do cattle right, we can do it. But simply just throwing up more electric fence and putting cattle on, pretending that they're going to function like they would on introduced cool season pasture is just going to be a whole different story. So the cows you see on the hillside are grazing species from Europe and Asia that are well adapted to getting grazed into the ground. And a lot of our native communities have these pulses of growth that just don't align with that immediately. We are working to integrate native species into our grazing systems, and there's been a lot of good work about that, but there's still a lot more to be done. So mindfully, yes. Long answer, yes. Short answer, a little bit more time.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It's just as you're talking about the disturbance regimes that they're needed and buffalo keep coming up in this system. That's why I was kind of curious. Well, do we have something that we use now? Because obviously, I don't think in the eastern U.S. we're going to have wild herds of buffalo roaming free anytime in the near future. We've got too many subdivisions, too many suburban, urban. It just doesn't work for our system anymore. But being able to bring in these other things, and I know so often we think with endangered species and threatened species, it's, ooh, push them off to the side. Don't look at them too much. They might explode or die off, but just very protective. And it sounded like this is something that doesn't need, it needs to be protected, but it has to be disturbed in a protected way. So,
well, particularly for stoloniferum, there needs to be a right amount of disturbance. And there's a case being made that there needs to be some kind of disturbance in some of these other species. But it's probably not going to be get a whole bunch of toddlers, give them cleats, and have them run across the landscape. Though that has been actually floated as an idea to maintain the species.
oh, wow.
I mean, if you're a yard owner, there are cases where some of these species are persisting just fine without big scary buffalo. If you've ever been to Lexington and gone to the Ashland, the Henry Clay estate, there's actually running buffalo clover growing on the grounds, and you can walk right by it in that turf. And it's being maintained because it's getting regularly mowed and it's getting regularly disturbed by visitors. And that's been a big case for why a lot of people have asked me in the native plant community, Clover Lawns, tell me about Clover Lawns. Talk to me more about Clover Lawns. I know that you were trying to talk a little bit about that, Shannon, earlier about.
We were going to bring it up. Go for it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, in general, and I'm coming at this from a forage specialist position where we're focusing more on putting grass into cattle and trying to feed cattle as opposed to a turf condition. A clover lawn is definitely an option. There's a lot of extension literature about using clovers as cover crops. And if you were to just throw them out there and not rip them up, then in theory, you'd have a lawn for a while. But again, it really depends on your goals for your yard and how you want to integrate different species. When you look on the internet and you Google clover lawns, most of the time they're recommending those Dutch type white clovers, itty bitty white clovers, European, North African, East Asian species that's being seeded into your yard, and you're maintaining that. And over time, the stolons keep the lawn growing, though you may have to thicken it up from time to time based on some experience here and there from others. But if we're talking about potential benefits compared to another yard, this might be a great opportunity. It really depends on your management perspective. I know that a lot of people listening to this podcast are probably going to be more ecologically minded and a little more hesitant to put down some of these lawn chemicals and preventative sprays. So if you're okay with having a little bit of diversity in the background, you can totally make you can totally grow a solid stand of clover. I guess the question generally becomes, what are your goals? So I think you'd probably ask me, well, my goals would be, let's try and include pollinators in my landscape, or I really want something that's going to handle my dogs running around. And in that case, even though we might be native plant purists, white clover is going to work really well in doing that. White clover, for the most part, has a lot of flowers at different times of the year. A lot of our native species, they have one reproductive window. And so when we think about providing for pollinators over the season, having a few bursts of things is going to be great, especially in the case of white clover. So we're spreading out when the buffet is available. Mm-hmm. Though this isn't to hate on the natives. I love them. That's my whole gig. In pollinator gardens, a lot of these species are great for pollinators, a lot of times in the off season. So luckily, if we're talking about Kentucky and into the transition zone where we're going from a temperate climate to a subtropical climate, we get to include a lot of winter annual clovers that if you throw in your yard, because you're not going to be running around there in the off season and, into the early spring, just make great, beautiful ground cover. We think a lot about crimson clover, Trifolium incarnatum, which has been used for years to stand between corn and soybean rotations as kind of just hold the ground in place. And that's just a great start for your off season. If you're just starting out and you have a Bermuda grass lawn, you throw some crimson clover out and that'll do you great. If we're talking about trying to maintain permanent ground cover, though, I'd say white clover works very well for cover crop systems, and it might work well for your system. But be mindful, there isn't necessarily a lot of academic research in the area of clover lawns because a lot of people have historically wanted grass because it stands up to trampling. But who knows? If you're willing to get started, there's a lot of work for some of these native species about using them for lawns that is starting to come to mind and getting discussed.
That's interesting because I've always hesitated in Kentucky to recommend truly replacing a yard with clover. If you want to put white clover in, go for it. But don't try and do the whole yard is what I've always kind of recommended, simply because, one, the trampling factor doesn't hold up as well to grass if you're going to be out there running around on it. And two, if we get one of our hot, dry summers in Kentucky, the clover's just kind of done. So you want to have something else there. But I mean, you know more about clovers than I do. Am I thinking right with that, or am I off on it? Clover may be a lot more resilient than I think it is.
I think you're pretty close to on the money. I mean, for white clovers and a lot of our species, the amount of rooting depth that we get, that's really going to determine how well these plants do. And because clovers, wherever they are, whether they're on a stolon or they're just in a crown, a central point, they're going to put down a single tap root into the soil, and that's going to be where they're going to be pulling their water from. That's how they're going to be getting their minerals. Whereas if we're growing a grass sod, we have a lot of fibrous roots that are spreading out into the soil and are able to make a lot more contact to be able to get more water uptake. And so, yeah, if you get a really dry summer and you've only got white clover, you're going to have a very crisp yard for the most part. But also, if we're in the middle of winter and you're trying to deal with, especially here, we have a lot of freeze thaw, and the dog comes in covered in mud, clover might be a good source. Of course, you've got to put that into your mind as a homeowner. You've got to lay out what are my goals and what are my resources. A big thing that we can do, especially in the terms of conservation, is here are my resources. And if we lead with that, a lot of helpful people in conservation are able to match you with, given these resources and your goals, here's what we can do. So if we're somebody where I'm a retiree, I don't go into my yard a lot during the winter, by all means, go throw some crimson clover out, go throw some white clover out, and just let it go to town, and it'll be what it is. And it'll be beautiful and gorgeous, and you'll be helping out pollinators, often at that start of the season where they're still kind of hungry and they're recovering from winter, and you're providing a lot of resources. But let's say I'm, a father and I have 3 kids and I've got 2 hyperactive dogs. Clover might be part of my system, but it might be kind of hard to rely entirely on it. Again, considerations, goals, where are we at?
Right. There's no one answer for everybody. That's what I'm always tell people is that whenever we're talking about planting anything, there isn't a simple one-size-fits-all answer, or at least not a good one-size-fits-all answer for any of this.
Exactly. I mean, a good place in general, if you want to get started with clovers and you're in a situation where you're willing to dip your toes in, is for a lot of our pasture communities, we recommend putting about 2 pounds of white clover seed to the acre into sods of existing grass. And if that's something that you feel comfortable trying, that might be a good place to start. The disclaimer is that we haven't necessarily tested it in a university setting, but if it works for you and it meets some of your pollinator needs, then it's a great success story.
And I think we should probably go back and mention the difference between red and crimson clover, because I've gotten asked this several times. Red clover, what we're referring to, is the one that has the balls of purple flowers. And then crimson clover has more of a almost pyramidal or diamond shape flower head that's bright red.
Yes. And a way I like to think of it is that if you look at it from the side, it's waving at you and it's trying to say hi. So if you get a good stand of it, both of them are pretty fuzzy, which is, shoot, I was going to say, well, one's fuzzier than the other, but for somebody who's looking at these two, I don't know, then it's like, well, relative fuzziness is terrible character for botany. But a good way to think of it would be the crimson clover, Incarnatum, is going to be fuzzier. It's going to be fuzzier. I gave up. It's going to be lighter green, and the leaves are going to look a little bit more circular than what you're going to see on a red clover. Another thing is that crimson clover is a winter annual throughout most, because we're talking in the eastern United States, it's a winter annual for most of us. So it's probably not going to be available at the same time that you're buying red clover seed.
And I've got a question. You may not be able to answer this. Why is red clover called red clover, not purple clover?
It's one of those great questions that I wish I knew. And, for all the work that I've read on it, I couldn't tell you. I think given that crimson clover is newer in terms of domestication and widespread introduction into a lot of these production markets, I think red clover was the reddest thing that we had. And I think, too, that also matters about when you catch it, because some of the older varieties of red clover have a lot different coloration and a lot different habits than some of our newer stuff. Red clover is actually one of the most bred plants that we've done in terms of a lot of our agricultural species. And Kentucky used to be the world's repository of clovers, and we'll probably get to that at some point in the discussion, but a lot of the red clover breeding in the United States in some way traces back to work in Kentucky.
You did bring up Kentucky and some of the research and genetic work that's been done here. Do you want to tell us some about your research? Because I know you've looked at propagation of some of our native clovers as well, but how that all kind of fits in and kind of give us an overview, because I think that's pretty interesting.
Kentucky is the center of a whole bunch of ecoregions and a lot of biodiversity converging from across the country, but also a lot of the research in my field, my main field, which is agronomy and crop science, has occurred in Kentucky. A lot of the clover work that occurred in the past 50 years has in one way or another been tied to Dr. Norm Taylor of the University of Kentucky. So in the 1950s, Dr. Taylor looked out and he had a vision of collecting every known trifolium species in the world. And he spent the next 50 years doing that. And so when we look at a lot of seed collecting and a lot of seed banking research with a lot of different genera, when we think about cousins of corn, cousins of tomatoes, cousins of all these different grasses, a lot of that work is we need to figure out what's the cousin to our main agricultural species. And we're going to collect those just in case we need drought tolerance brought in from this guy, or flavor brought in from this guy, or we're trying to collect a lot of the genetic diversity that's tied to a lot of these relatives of what we're growing for food. The neat thing about the clover collection that Norm Taylor developed was he also took an effort towards conservation and trying to maintain native species just because they existed. And compared to a lot of our other native species, the clover gene banks are a lot older and they're a lot more well collected. So Norm collected a lot of the native species in the eastern United States, and they've been deposited since his passing. They used to all be in Lexington, and they've since been moved to Pullman, Washington, and Griffin, Georgia, as part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's GRIN network, and that's just the Germplasm Resources Information Network. So a lot of this seed has been collected, and it represents genetic diversity from specific populations in Kentucky, as well as across the range. And so we have a lot of good work there. How that ties into my research is that Norm Taylor has a lot of influence on how we do native clover research. A lot of these species are in small populations or they're in protected positions where it's really hard to deal with wild material. However, if you go to the USDA and you request seed, you can get a packet of seed that at some point or another was grown in a greenhouse in Lexington, which is the neatest thing.
That is.
So I started out working with native clovers at Ohio State under Dave Barker in the Horton Crop Science Department. The plants that he had grown came from some populations that in one way or another trace their way back to Kentucky. I've been doing a lot of work in the time since trying to trace these records because Norm Taylor passed away, and as his collection was being divided, it's been really hard to track these populations back to. So what time in the 1980s or 90s did he find this particular species at this particular place? And what does this accession tie back to? So a lot of our research, at least from the people I've worked with, we have the accession number. And that's great because someday we'll figure out where that place actually came from and we can connect the dots back. But we're dealing with the kind of the legacy of Norm behind us. And so a lot of my research was done on these plants where if you look at the notes, and I think my favorite is I got a spreadsheet once from the University of Kentucky discussing what are these plants, what does this accession tie to, and we'll look at like 63712 and it'll be identified a whole nother way. Location, United States, Kentucky, because it just occurred in the whole state of Kentucky at one point. And the level of improvement, which is generally their term for, okay, has anybody bred it? Has there been anything? And a lot of them are uncertain improvement status. Now, Norm Taylor didn't just conserve clover plants, he was doing breeding work. So we don't know if some of these have been tinkered with in their gene pool, or if we've tried to select the best plants from this population and move them forward. So there's some work with that. A lot of my work has been involved with trying to ask agronomic questions that tie back to the ecology. Ecology is how does the natural system work? And then agronomy is how do I take the tools to make it work? So when we're dealing with a landscape like we've discussed, where we've taken the bison, we've taken the fire, we've changed the way that the hydrology works, and we've done a lot of alteration on the land use. Okay, how do we bring the plant back and how do we make it stay using the tools we have? So one of my earliest studies, and the one that I had a lot of fun with early on, was this reclaimed Mineland study where I grew plants in vermiculite, which is a fancy term for fancy sand. And I subjected them to acid and iron sulfate treatments to see would these plants grow in the conditions of a reclaimed mineland compared to white clover. And we saw some evidence that kind of put them in the same category. And, we got to see a little bit more about how they persisted. As I was mentioning with the Shawnee Lookout work, where we put plants out in the field, we did an experiment where we collected clippings of the running buffalo clover, brought them into the greenhouse, grew them up into full-size plants, and made cuttings. So we basically cloned, quotation marks, these plants and sent our clone army back into the field to see how they would do. And we found out that planting in the fall seems to be the most successful way to get these running buffalo clover plants back into the field. There have been some exceptions to this rule, and I would direct listeners to look out for Will Overbeck and some of his work out of Illinois, as well as I've done some work in glaciated Indiana, where it seemed like a spring planting works, but we're trying to figure out how planting experiments work for the native clovers. In terms of what I have done during my master's degree and here at the start of my PhD, again, I've been doing a lot of tracking. Where did these plants originally come from? There's nothing more exciting than getting a packet of an endangered species and the label says Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Because it's so hard to do a reintroduction or to ever have these plants go back into the wild because where in Ohio are they from? Like, we don't want to contaminate existing populations. And we also don't want to just say, well, we got to throw away this endangered plant. So there's a lot of space for them where we use them in research projects and we try and examine them. So it's the hope that we'll eventually trace these guys back to where they belong. I've done a lot of work with trying to get plants propagated. And you mentioned this several times, and I really hate that we haven't touched on it a lot, but a big thing that I do is I'll get seed in. We'll see how to germinate the seed by getting it started in, say, a petri dish on filtered paper and trying to see, okay, what are the requirements for germination? Do I need to scarify, which means rub it with sandpaper to take off some of that seed coat? Does it need to get a cold treatment where it sits in the fridge for a while and then comes out? And then germinate it, see if we can get plants out of that. And one of the big things that we're currently working on is just going from seed to seed. What does it take to make these plants grow? I did a big experiment in 2019 where I started a whole bunch of plants in January, and we almost got everybody seed to seed, but then we had squirrels break into our clover cage, which I called it, and that was keeping the plants safe from the herbivores. But that's a big effort that we're undertaking. One of my special projects right now has been trying to do seed increases for the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. Tara Littlefield is in charge of that office, and she is the best ever at helping me with getting and meeting research goals. Hey, we would like this done, where I'm in a generally university setting where, okay, let's make that happen. So big things we've worked on is Kentucky's namesake clover, Kentuckiense, which is a species recently described in 2013. And it was known to only 2 sites and has not been seen this past field season. So there's an extra emphasis on us to take the existing seed and try and do increases and just have plant material going. There's been some great work out of Cincinnati Zoo Botanical Garden with embryo rescue and tissue culture. And where I fit into that equation is the afterward. How do we develop plants that'll go into the field, establish, grow from there? Or how do we grow plants outside of tissue culture and embryo rescue? Because in the wild, the plant's going to have to drop a viable seed. The seed's going to have to come up and grow with the conditions around it. And how do we get that back out in the field? I'm also doing some work with the annual buffalo clover reflexum. I've been tasked with trying to get seed developed from the population in Hamilton County, Ohio, the West Fork Woods, where Lucy Brown did some botanizing, and Dan Boone, the descendant of the original Dan Boone, has done subsequent botany work, and we're very close friends about that. I've also collected from one of the Western Kentucky reflexum sites with permission from the state, and I'm trying to get some seed increased from there. Just a lot of the work that I do is either getting seed increases or trying to ask very applied questions. One of the big things, and I actually finished a phone call about it this morning, was we're looking to do a greenhouse study here at Virginia Tech regarding the intensity and frequency of defoliation on running buffalo clover and a few of these other species. So in grazing, and this would be the discussion of including grazing in these systems, is the 2 big things that when producers are doing rotational grazing or anything is how low am I cutting the vegetation and how often? Mm-hmm. And in theory, we don't want it to be getting cut low very often or being cut very rarely, very infrequently. Both of these conditions are bad for most of our grassland species and a lot of our vegetation and grazing ecosystems, or in ecosystems with some level of disturbance. Vegetation has to be removed. Mm-hmm. Given that we can't really burn large tracts, taking away vegetation can be helpful. Or if we can't run buffalo, then running a mower would be helpful, or running cattle like we were talking earlier. So we're trying to figure out how low should we cut these plants and how often for a few of these species. And hopefully we should be able to come up with some recommendations.
And with your research, you were talking about in some of the studies you were planting plants that you had cloned, made cuttings off of. That in the plant world, that's cloning. Mm-hmm. And then you were also talking about doing the seed increases and trying to get more seed. Have you compared how well the stands take off if you've seeded versus put the plants out there and done these plantings? Or is that beyond the scope of anything that's been done so far? Because I know you can't do everything at once.
Oh, no. I'm glad you asked. Dr. Barker at Ohio State undertook a seed planting at one of the sites in Ohio, Congress Green, with Trifolium stoloniferum. And they seeded little 1-foot square spots, and those were their little research plots because there's not a lot of seed present. And I think that was the funniest way of how they came up with that was because it's a cemetery, so you're not supposed to disturb the hallowed grounds of where one of the presidents, Harrison, is buried. So rather than digging a hole and putting a plant in the ground, they decided to seed into it. And I don't have any data off of that just yet, but it's quite encouraging to see kind of the methodology, and we're developing procedures on that. I think the goal in the state of Kentucky, and a little bit of a goal of mine personally, would be to try and do similar experiments with some of these other species, particularly Kentuckiense and reflexum. The big thing to think of here with a lot of this conservation research and work is there's been a lot of effort thrown behind plants that have just historically come to mind because of how much seed is available, or the opposite end. They're just very rare and hard to find. So running buffalo clover is one of the ones that's better collected and represented in the USDA seed bank. So a lot of people have been able to tinker with it. A lot of people have been able to set up experiments, and there's been a lot that's been built around this model system. So model system in this case is, we kind of know how this one works really well, and we could probably extrapolate it to others. So we're just going to learn as much as we can about this and then try and make recommendations about to others. And it's also, everybody knows how it works and everybody has the same set of toys. So if my accession 566 does this, then theirs in theory should. So extrapolate from mine to theirs. Mm-hmm. The other side of that, like I'm saying with Kentucky clover, is that there's just so little wild plant material left, or maybe it might not even exist in the wild anymore, that we really just want to get seeds made and we want to have plants growing. So that way we just have the species persisting into the future. And we're not even thinking about trying to seed into the wild just yet. We're just trying to get plants built up. And there's been a lot of good work. The Kentucky Botanical Symposium discussed some conservation horticulture efforts and things like that. Kentucky clover probably falls more into the, we've just got to keep it going. Whereas running buffalo clover, we're starting to move to the levels of how do we manage the species? Where does it fit at the landscape level? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and that makes sense because we're going to know more about some species than others. And even though running buffalo clover is an endangered species, and at one time we thought it was extinct until it was rediscovered again, we've learned quite a bit about it, but there's so many other species that we don't know so much about. And like you said, Kentuckiensis was just discovered a few years ago. Was it running buffalo clover that we used to think it was part of, or which one was it?
It was the other buffalo clover, which, I mean, this is, we've got to go hunt down whoever came up with these common names and make some redirections about some of these things. But yeah, Kentuckiensis is a random off chance discovery, and it originally was thought to be reflexum, the annual buffalo clover. It occurred in a different spot in the outer bluegrass of Kentucky. It was going in a little bit of a different ecosystem, so a little bit more closed, a little bit more like stoloniferum with the herbivory component. There was a lot of deer trails near it. It just didn't make sense where it was. And so after some taxonomic work, and this species actually is one of the last collections of clover from Norrin Taylor. He passed away soon after. So it's safe. There's 500 seeds in Georgia that are safe and secure and have my watchful eyes ordering for seed increases. But yeah, this is a very poorly represented species compared to some of our others. And compared to where we would find reflexum, which is more of a Western Kentucky sort of thing, it's a whole new world. Now, this is me talking about living plants existing right now. However, there's been some work by my colleague, Mason Brock, who's out of Austin Peay State University, Clarksville, Tennessee. And he's went and looked into herbarium records, the pressed plant records, and he's seen some evidence, and I verified them when I worked at the University of Tennessee, of Kentuckiensis existing in the late 1870s and 1880s in places we wouldn't have thought. Like there's a very strong candidate of Kentucky clover that occurred in the 1870s or 1880s from Augustine Gattinger, one of the first people to really look at the flora of Kentucky, Tennessee area. And if only he was more specific, because it says dry pasture, Nashville, Tennessee, which is kind of like when I look at a seed packet and I see Ohio. So,
yeah, Nashville, Tennessee. Okay, yeah, mid-state. That's a pretty big distance there, but yeah.
It's a strong case to be made, and you look at some of this is probably one of the better parts of the SGI initiative, which is helpful on my end. Is okay, somebody goes through, figures out the historical record, says look here, and here, and then we go from there. Dwayne Estes actually invited me out to Nashville to go look at the clover bottom in Nashville, where there was supposedly a lot of big clover, one of the initial settlements that kind of failed in early Nashville history. And we were looking at the site adjacent because it might still be in the woods. And it was a very strong candidate habitat for some of these species, particularly, I would say, more the stoloniferum as opposed to Kentuckiensis. And we're really looking for those kind of habitats. We're looking for those kind of spaces based off of historical records. So by all means, some of these early settlement records are almost as helpful as me knowing What's the pH of the soil I need to put this in? What sort of media should I be using? And it's very helpful in terms of when we're actually growing plants, where are we growing them for? It's a big question that doesn't always get asked when we do native plant nurseries and cultures.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I got two big takeaways from that. The first being 500 seeds does not sound like a lot to be holding possibly the entire existence of any single species. You're like, there's a lot. And I know in endangered species world that, yeah, that's a lot. But at the same time, that's not that much. And then the other thing, it sounds like it's just that everybody needs to keep paying attention and asking questions and not just write something off, because that's kind of what's happening, it sounds like, to Kentuckiensis for a while. And then somebody said, wait a minute, enough times that somebody paid attention and figured it out.
That really ties into a good point. The former chief botanist of Ohio, he's now at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. His name is Allison Cusick. One of the best things he told me is the best way to find some of these native clovers is just happenstance. You're more likely to find it not looking for it than you are if you went looking for it to find it. We alluded to the stoloniferum rediscovery.
Mhm.
So stoloniferum, at some point, people just stopped looking for it in the 1940s. There weren't a lot of herbarium specimens collected and put on pieces of paper. So we just kind of assumed it went extinct. And then in 1983, it was rediscovered in West Virginia. And a lot of states went and did a lot of surveying efforts. And more often than not, a lot of these surveying efforts found these clovers just by stumbling around rather than, we should find it at this spot. We need to go hunting in this spot, and a whole lot of nothing. And then somebody leans over. I actually had that experience. I went to go use the restroom on one of our trips to go plant the plants out into a new site. And I was stooping down, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but I did pee on the one running buffalo clover plant that was naturally occurring at that site. And one of the folks from Fish and Wildlife Service admired that plant, and I made sure they didn't get too close to it. But
Yeah.
you have those. Happenstance is the name of the game for finding them in the wild. And I don't know if that's really been discussed as much with Dwayne, but in the case of Mason Brock's work and mine, Mason's really good at getting to a certain spatial scale with some of these herbarium collections, but that does not mean that he's going to drop right on top of that plant and find another one right there. So quick disclaimer, if you go to some of these herbarium websites and you're looking for plants, don't expect to just drop right on top of them. Chances are they've probably moved maybe a few 100 yards, or the whole site has changed because of the development around it, or it might not even be there anymore. One of my favorite populations is, I didn't find out until I went to college that there was endangered clovers. And then I found out that there were some 5 miles from my hometown growing in what later became an addition to our hometown dump.
Oh, no.
So Mount Rumpke in southwestern Ohio actually used to be a habitat for running buffalo clover. The plants got relocated, and some of them have survived, but I mean, man, just a trash pile.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in Kentucky, and I was the person who I was going to get as far away from Kentucky as fast as I could. All the really cool wildlife and stuff lived somewhere far, far away. And bouncing around on summer jobs and stuff, I figured out I kind of like Kentucky. We've got some pretty cool things here. Yeah, I think we all fall into that trap of overlooking what's right outside our doors. And that's kind of why I wanted to start this podcast, because I waited so long to really appreciate what's out there. And I know so many other people, some who are much older than I am, who are now saying the same things. And now you're saying it coming from another generation. So it's really that whole kind of ties it in. I don't want people to keep missing out on this cool stuff we have right there, whether it's all the diversity that Kentucky has or diversity of Ohio, Tennessee. I mean, every state's got it in one way or another.
One of the big things, and I was one of those kids who I took a few field jobs where I went to Missouri and South Dakota, and those were very informative experiences. But one of the big takeaways, especially for Backyard Ecology as a podcast, is that there's a lot of native diversity that's right here. And thanks to a lot of efforts, there's more that's kind of returning, especially with native plant nurseries and people taking effort to deliberately plant things into their yards, which is a great introduction. But there's a lot of beautiful diversity and stuff that are hidden in these states and in our area. The eastern United States are not blessed in the fact that we have these magnificent rolling plains or these big temperate forests as much as we have a lot of diversity concentrated in little areas, which is why when we were talking about the clover diversity gradient, we were like, clover, 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 and then it just kind of drops off again because Kentucky has a lot of different regions moving from east to west, north to south. And then when we go from the coast inland, or if we go down the seaboard, there's just a lot of changes associated with our mountains and some of our different ecosystems that have kind of formed over the years. And for those of you who are interested in growing some of these natives, I'm sorry to tell you, but there's not a lot that are being commercially developed because a lot of them are threatened, protected, or endangered. However, there's a move towards that direction, and there's been some work. I'm talking to a nurseryman in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's talking about trying to get some of these species available for people to buy and put into their yards. And there are some opportunities. If you're really a diehard Clover fan, you want to talk more, my contact information is going to be listed in the podcast, and we can talk about if you'd like to be interested in some of these research trials about trying to get these plants out. One of the big things just though is to really enjoy them. And with native clovers, I think one of the biggest things that's been brought to my attention is that these clovers are a special novel part of an ecosystem. And they require us to do a lot of things that are really out of our comfort zone as botanists, ecologists, or just homeowners. What do you mean there's this plant that looks like all the stuff we brought over from Europe? What do you mean it's tied to this system of living that doesn't really exist anymore, or this place that doesn't exist anymore? And what do you mean that they fit in this weird spot between these pristine ecosystems we're not allowed to look at, or, the cow pasture across the road?
Yeah, I like that. And that's really a great way to wrap it up, I think, because we've been chatting for a while. I want to make sure I'm conscientious of your time too. But is there anything else that you want to add in here or say?
Really what matters when it comes to appreciating these clovers is just firstly to be aware of them and to keep your mind out. There's a lot of books that are floating around about some of the European species, and we're doing some work with the Kentucky Native Plant Society to put out, here are the clovers of the eastern United States at some point.
Oh, cool.
Here's some photos, here's some stuff to look for, and this might be something down the line to keep an eye for. But just knowing they exist and helping to keep an awareness to, these are probably some of our best indicators of how our ecosystem used to function. I think that a lot of people need to ask more about, when we're talking about clover yards, a lot of discussion needs to shift to, what am I doing this for? What do I have available? How do I want to do this? And accepting some of the balance. We brought these species over from Europe for a reason. Some of them just do their jobs. They're tools in a toolkit. If we want to say that we don't want to use those tools, that's great. But to start out with, I want a clover yard, it has to be all native, it has to be this and this, really forgets the fact we don't have the native seed. You don't know what your yard's purpose is for. We got to think about it in the right way. And really, I think the last thing I could leave for was just take more advantage of some of these agronomy and horticulture resources that are available to a lot of people. The land grant system in the United States has been viewed as one of the most important contributions of America to the world, partially because it unifies education, practically helping people, and getting research done. So if you ask your extension agency, or if you can ask your local land grant university, I'm interested in this, can you look into this for me? You are helping contribute to shifting our research focus, helping direct what questions we want to answer, and hopefully trying to get some of these clovers back into the landscape. So just give them a call. There's an agency in almost every county.
And that's throughout the Eastern U.S. And I always tell people the extension offices are amazing. I'm always talking to them, and they've got some really phenomenal people. And if they don't know the answer, they've got the resources to know who to go to eventually find the answer and then get back to you with it. Yeah, I mean, this has been awesome. And I've learned so much and had so much fun. Thanks so much for talking with us today. And like you said, I will have links in the show notes for our listeners that want to learn more, both for your contact information and some of the resources that you sent me as places to start looking for more information. But unless you have anything else, I'll just say thanks so much for talking with us today. And this has been great. Thanks.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Me too.
I appreciate Jonathan taking the time to talk with us today. I love how his work is bringing together both conservation and agronomy. I really think that we need more people to bridge different fields and bring in those new perspectives that so often lead to new ways of thinking and better understandings of the system as a whole. Being one of those bridges isn't always easy, but they can be so valuable. One of the reasons that I wanted to have Jonathan talk with us today is simply because I get asked so often about clover yards. I think he brought up some great points on how clovers can be used in a yard and the importance of considering your resources, your goals, and your needs. I also find it exciting to think that maybe one day we might be able to include some of our native clovers in that mix. Of course, there's a lot that still needs to happen before that will be possible, but I like the fact that it's part of the conversation, even with some of our endangered species. I also really enjoyed learning about the different disturbance regimes that many of our native clovers need. When we think about bison or buffalo, the eastern U.S. is usually not the first place that comes to our minds. But we did have bison here, and many of our native clovers relied on the disturbance created by those herds of bison. In fact, bison were so important to many of our native clovers that many of them have buffalo as part of their common names. That's why Jonathan and I often fell back on the scientific names for our native clovers. The names running buffalo clover and annual buffalo clover are just too similar and easy to get confused. It's much easier to simply say stoloniferum or reflexum and drop buffalo clover altogether. I think his points about keeping good records so others can trace back the source of a plant and the importance of herbarium records and other historic collections were also very important. I just really enjoyed this whole episode and learned a lot from it. I hope you did too. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to ask you to please take a minute and go to www.backyardecology.net/interest-survey and let me know what you are interested in hearing more about. I use the information from these surveys to guide the topics I cover in the Backyard Ecology blog and podcast. And until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.